There are many reasons to avoid fillers like there are. Let's talk about fillers. In high school, you may have been praised for looking up words in the dictionary, but dictionaries and encyclopedias give common definitions intended to serve as many people as possible. If you can look it up on dictionary.com or famousquotes.com, so can anyone else reading your paper. So that silly quote, don't believe every quote you find on the internet, Abraham Lincoln, yeah, it's funny, it's amusing, but a quote like that does not demonstrate your ability to think at the college level. It takes up space. College research doesn't ask you to present the correct answer that anyone can look up. Your profs expect that you can look up words that you don't understand. If you don't understand what you're writing about, your paper won't make much sense. So yes, understanding what you read is important. But in college, we explore issues where smart, informed, well-meaning people disagree. So we don't stop looking when we find one answer that the back of our textbook, or maybe that the first hit in a Google search says is correct. That's not how college works. Starting your paper with a famous quote or dictionary definition is taking up space that your professor would probably rather you use defending your own original critical thinking. And dictionaries and encyclopedias are sort of common areas where you present a general answer that serves a lot of people's needs. But what's different about college is asking you to consult individual named scholars who might controversially disagree with other experts. Scholars publish articles or books because what they found isn't in the encyclopedias and the dictionaries, and they want to present their new knowledge to the world for the first time. College asks you to consult with those individual scholars whose new ways of looking at the world may be pushing to change knowledge. So college research is not just looking up what everybody already knows. You're looking at scholars who are trying to convince their readers that this thing that they are announcing that nobody else has discovered before is the truth. And scholars disagree because sometimes the truth is a little bit harder to determine than it appears. So you do cite an individual named expert's definition of a term that's got some wiggle room. Here's an example of when you might want to define a term like race. Let's say a native activist, John Lee, is evaluating a statue at a monument. Lee might offer his own individual definition of race as part of a cultural analysis of a stereotype that he finds when he looks at a statue, if his point is to say that the statue is somehow racially insensitive. But let's imagine that Mary Parker is a geneticist, and she's exploring the relationship between malaria and sickle cell anemia. She might want to specify how her scientific study came about with determining the race of the individuals whose blood that she's studying, as part of making an argument about racial discrimination in healthcare. For these two different scholars, the term race may mean very, very different things, and so they would carefully define that for John Lee, race is a social construct. For Mary Parker, race is a way that she's determining somebody's genetic makeup. Another example of a term that you might really want to define, death. An individual neurologist or an individual priest from a particular denomination of religion or an individual lawyer may have very, very different definitions of death. And in a paper in which you are citing lawyers or neurologists or theologians, Dictionary.com's definition of that term may have very little to do with what a particular lawyer needs to know. But getting back to the word there are, it's filler. So in this example, there are many desserts on the table in the next room. Among the desserts are apple pies, cheesecake, and cookies. Well, There are doesn't add anything new to the sentence. And among the desserts, that's another thing. It's wasteful. Let's just trim that down and let's just say, among the many desserts on the table in the next room are apple pies, cheesecake, and cookies. If we cut out there are and rephrase a little bit, we've saved a couple words. Now, saving 3 words may not be all that important, but let's keep going. Let's drop the among the many desserts, and now we got 13 words, and now we're starting to make some progress here. It is important to note that wordy phrases suck. Well, do I need to say it is important to note that? That's another example of a wordy phrase. There may be other phrases that are wordy. Some people may say wordy phrases are annoying. It being that wordy phrases are awkward, we should avoid them. In my personal opinion, students shouldn't be so wordy. As you can see from these examples, what I'm doing here is I'm demonstrating all these things are common phrases that I find in student papers. Instead of saying it is important to note that wordy phrases suck, just say wordy phrases suck. And there are, there is, it could be, there might be. These are all examples of wordy phrases. Instead of telling me what some people may say, in academic scholarship, we need to know Smith argues, Jones discovered. Instead of talking about what some people may say, your college professors want you to engage with what individual named scholars actually have written in the scholarship that you've studied. And this phrase, it being that wordy phrases are awkward, just say because wordy phrases are awkward. I honestly have no idea where it being that comes from. All opinions are personal, so in a phrase like in my personal opinion, the personal doesn't add anything. And in general, your college professors probably will not be asking you to insert your personal opinion in research papers. And this phrase, as you can see from, you're really calling a lot of attention to the work that you're doing introducing a quote. Call my attention to the idea in the quote. So, Smith's data shows. Lee's claim underscores. Brown's challenge reignites. Those are very, very direct, specific connections between the reader and the ideas in the scholarship. Rather than saying, as you can see from this quote, in this next quote that will help me make my argument, an opposing view to my argument might be, all those phrases take up space that a well-phrased, very efficient paper would avoid. When I looked at the table, I saw many plates of unclaimed oatmeal raisin and sugar cookies and several untouched apple pies. So if these details are important to your paper, well, rather than telling me that this is what happens when you looked, just if you tell me what you saw, that's, I don't need to know that you looked at the table in order to read what you saw on the table. And that phrase, maybe your college professors won't want you to insert yourself into the story, so you might find yourself rephrasing it as something like this. Inspection of the table revealed. But still, you're doing the inspection, and that whole thing about revealing, I don't know, there's more wordiness. Let's think of another way to phrase it completely. So we have 39 words on the left, a 15-word revision. In the next room, untouched cookies and apple pies share the dessert table with cheesecake. Can you think of anything on the left that's missing from the version on the right that needs to be there? Well, let's trim it even more. Do we need to know that the table's in the next room? And if the table's got cookies and apple pies and cheesecake on it, do we need to call it a dessert table? So maybe we can trim this down to just 10 words. And I would say those 10 words on the right are better than the 39 words on the left. I mean, which would you rather read? Here we have the whole second sentence that there are these other kinds of things on the table and untouched apple pies. I've covered that in the 5 blue words. And all this stuff in yellow, you can see on the left, that's more words. So I've left out in the next room, and I've left out the flavors of the cookies. Is that important? I don't know. It depends on what you're saying in your paper. Maybe it would be important, but if you've trimmed out a lot of needless words, you have space to put back in any of these important details that you might find you actually need in order to make your argument. Aunt Lucy brought 3 of her famous cheesecakes, of which 2 are still untouched, hidden behind piles of unwanted cookies and pies. There are several courses of action we might take. One possibility we could try is, there are several. We've got another example of there are here. So just as the original sample introduced the contents of the table with that do-nothing sentence, there are many desserts on the table, this paragraph a little bit farther on introduces an argument with the do-nothing sentence, there are several courses of action we might take. What I really want to know is, in your paper, what course of action are you going to advocate? What's the point of your paper? Maybe on the left, the student would eventually get to the idea. But in green, you can see the number of times on the left we've mentioned the desserts. What matters about the desserts seems to be that 2 of them are blocking people's access to a third. But look how far into the paragraph we get before we see the first references to this problem. In yellow, we see some references to a problem. And in blue, we have a hint that maybe there's something we can do about it. But that's still a lot of words, and we still don't know what's going on. What point is this author making? We can make all the ideas on the left more efficiently, but those words on the right still aren't making a claim. If your professor wants you to solve a problem or defend an argument, a paragraph that has 2 there are's introducing stuff is not going to help you. Because untouched cookies and apple pies share the table with Aunt Lucy's famous cheesecake, we should put an extra table in the front hall just for her. And I'm going to add, the problem is that these cookies and apple pies are making it hard for people to find. So I've inserted in blue, put an extra table in the front hall, and I've inserted make it hard for people to find. The short version on the right actually tells us what the problem is and actually suggests a solution. Let's take a look at that make it hard for people to find. Now this might be a little bit poetic, but make it hard for people to find camouflage. If we change that whole phrase into camouflage, now we're down to 24 words. Careful revision yields much more efficient writing. There's a lot of stuff on the left that doesn't need to be there. If we cut all the yellow stuff, we can assume that the version on the right, your reader will get that there are many desserts on the table. The desserts are named and a table is referenced, so we know it's about desserts on the table. The light blue part, camouflaging Aunt Lucy's famous cheesecake, that tells us why the reader should care. On the left, we get through 2 sentences before we find out why the reader should care. Many readers will give up reading before they get to why it matters. We know it's all about cookies, pies, and cheesecake, but look at the number of times on the left that cookies, pies, and cheesecake were mentioned in several different sentences. On the right, we've trimmed down those references so it's much more efficient. And on the left, we have a sentence that says there are several courses of action, but on the right, we know what action you recommend. Spelling all this stuff out wastes your reader's time. Treat your reader like they're intelligent, and you will seem intelligent. Paragraphs and sentences that prove to me you can list things are not as important. They're not as useful. They won't get you as many points as the sentences that demonstrate you can connect things, that you can help me understand how these things relate, why they're important, or the sentences that tell me why you think this course of action that you're advocating is a good course of action. And next in this sequence of lectures, we're going to talk about what's called Bloom's taxonomy, which is a list that's a hierarchy of critical thinking skills that start with summary and move all the way up to presenting your own original idea. And Bloom's taxonomy, I think, is a really interesting way that will help you make sure that you're spending time writing sentences that, instead of being full of filler, will be full of good ideas that your professor will be happy to read.